Hi, this is Jill from Fabric Garden, and I am here for your demonstration of the first month of Prairie Picnic Block of the Month. So you should have your kit by now, and I wanted to talk a little bit about my process when I start a new quilt. The first thing I always do is read my pattern. I like to not just blindly cut my fabric. I like to know what I am cutting for. Am I cutting for half square triangles, flying geese? I often keep a little notebook where I make notes as I'm reading, just to make sure that I'm not just blindly cutting. So that's one of the first things I do. And then I will prepare my fabric. I do like to use a starch product before I cut. I feel like when my fabric is starched, it cuts better, it frays less, it's just easier to work with the fabric. I like to work with Magic Quilting and Crafting Spray, but you might like Mary Ellen Best Press. Those are my two favorites. The Magic is what I keep at home and use personally. So the next thing that I want you to think about is your accuracy in cutting. The more accurate you are with your cutting, the better your blocks are going to go together. So take some time. Make sure you're reading your ruler. I used to have a ruler I would hold up to show you what my very first ruler is, and it would show you why I struggled initially when I started quilting. And I started quilting, let me see, it's been almost 30 years ago. And the ruler had these really thick lines on it. I just moved recently and I got rid of everything I wasn't using. And so I got rid of that ruler because it was really just to hold up and say, don't buy a ruler like this. But take your time, line up, read your lines on your ruler, get a nice accurate cut. I find that for me, there's a couple things that help me cut accurately. Starched fabric and a good ruler, good lighting. If you don't have good light, it's hard to really see, and I don't have the best vision in the world, so I do like to have good lighting. And the fourth thing is a good sharp rotary blade in my cutter. If you're having to go over the fabric 2 and 3 times to get it to cut, you are long past due for a new blade. A nice sharp blade makes it much easier. The other thing I wanted to quickly address is your 1/4 inch seam allowance. And so many times I hear people say, as long as I'm consistent, it's okay. And I don't want to scare you, but that's really not true. There are only a small set of circumstances where consistency will get you through. And that is if all your blocks are the same block. So if you've just cut 6-inch squares and you're doing it around the world or something like that, doesn't really matter. As long as all your seams are the same, it will work out. But the moment you have different blocks with different number of seams in them, consistency is no longer enough. I mean, think about it. If you're making a quilt that has 4 patches and 9 patches that are supposed to be the same size, a 4 patch just has a horizontal seam and a vertical seam. But a 9 patch has 2 horizontal seams, 2 vertical seams. So if your 1/4 inch seam allowance is a little bit too big, your 9 patch will come out smaller than your 4 patch because it has more seams. So This is a sampler quilt, and all the blocks are going to have different number of seams. So your 1/4 inch seam is important in this. Now there are ways we can fix rows if they're not the right length, and as we sew our rows, we'll talk about filler blocks and how to overcome these things. But it's easier if you don't have to overcome them. So my recommendation is get yourself 3 strips of fabric that are 1.5 inches wide. They don't have to be very long, you know, just 6 or 7 inches long. You can do this with cutting scraps. 3 1.5 inch strips, and sew them together. 1, 2, 3. Then measure the center strip. That center strip should be 1 inch, because you've sewn a 1/4 inch on either side of the 1.5 inches. If it is less than 1 inch, then your 1/4 inch seam is too big. If it is bigger than 1 inch, then your 1/4 inch seam allowance is too small. One of the things that I have noticed in working in the classroom with people is most of us are using a 1/4 inch foot when we are quilting, and that's great. But I've noticed that certain machines, when you turn them on and the needle, you can hear it electronically center, it'll go bzzz, and the needle will buzz a little bit. A lot of machines center the needle for use with the utility foot, and it is not centered correctly for using the 1/4 inch foot. So I went to a retreat several years back, and I did not take my own machine, and they supplied a beautiful baby lock machines for us to sew on. And I had brought bunches of 1.5 inch little strips so that I could make sure I was getting a good 1/4 inch on a machine I wasn't familiar with. And when I put the 1/4 inch foot on and I centered and I sewed, I could visually see my 1/4 inch seam was way too big. And on that machine, it just took one bump of the needle to the right, and then I was good. So I actually took a little sticky note. I put it on the machine with what I liked the stitch length, and that when I turned the machine on to move the needle over one, so that, you know, when I went to lunch or dinner, I would remember when I came back and wouldn't end up with a bunch of weird size blocks. So take a moment, test your 1/4 inch seam. It will make all the difference in the outcome. So a lot of people want to test their seam by sewing and then laying their ruler on top of it, but it's really about what that seam measures once it's pressed, because the thickness of the fabric takes up some space, the thickness of the thread takes up some space, so it's really better to measure after you sew 3 strips together. You get a much more accurate reading of your 1/4 inch. So, okay, so I'm going to start. You're going to cut, and you are going to sew your strip sets just as pictured in the pattern, and you're going to make 4 strip sets. The pattern asks for you to press all seams in one direction. And I did this, and then after I cut my 7.5 inch blocks, I did not have nesting of seams. So I found that if you press 2 of your strip sets with all the seams going towards the brown fabric, and 2 of your strip sets with all of the seams going towards the gold fabric, then once you cut these and you go to sew them together, you will have really nice nesting of your blocks. And I will show that to you in a little bit. So you're going to sew 4 strip sets, and then you are going to need to cut 8 7.5 inch squares out of them. So I played around, how would it work if I didn't have a 7.5-inch ruler, and it's pretty tough. You're going to have to use some tape and mark your rulers, because the easiest way is to have a 7.5-inch ruler and use the bias line through the ruler to measure the center. If you are working with a different ruler, you're going to need to use tape and make your own bias line that makes it 7.5 inches to measure from. So if you don't have a 7.5-inch ruler, you can get one at the shop, or I'll carry this with me for a while, and if you want to come in and cut in the shop and use my ruler, you're welcome to do that too. Okay, so I've got my strip set here, and as you can see, the two outsides are wider, and then we've got 4 smaller strips that are the same size. It doesn't matter which side you have up, the brown or the yellow, it doesn't matter. Your center is always this yellow line. So if it's, you can see I've got big, small, small, big, small, small. This is going to be my center. And you can see this bias line. This gets lined up along my seam line. Now, this is kind of a tight squeeze. You can see if I push I'm going to spin this around so I have the end. Okay, so set that up. I'm putting my point. Now, I'm just going to make a tiny little mark here at the point, because I want to double check that I really have enough room. You probably can't see that little mark, but I can. And I'm just double checking that then when I put my ruler here, that I have enough fabric. Now over here, I am a smidge into the selvage, but as long as it's not more than 1/4 inch, that's going to get sewn into the seam allowance. So this is really tight. You're going to want to make this as tight to this edge. You can even have that point stick over a little bit if you want to. Now, I'm going to throw my rotating mat under here, but if you don't have one, you can move your, so I'm going to get this set, and I like how that's centered. It's all on the line. Let me move this so you can see better. Okay, I've got my sharp rotary blade. Now, I want to make, if it moves, I can reposition, but it's going to make it harder. So I'm going to cut, but when I get up to here, I don't want to overcut if possible, because I'm going to do my other block over here. So I'm going to cut, and I'm just going to get to that corner. Now I'm going to go the other way. Now I'm going to rotate and cut and cut. And before I lift this, I just want to make sure I got this corner over here cut, and I did. So now I can lift that away. And now I've got one of my blocks. And I'm going to do that one more time. Get this laid on using my bias. I'm going to get that over. I've lined that up on the seam line. And this time it doesn't matter what I do over here, because I don't have to worry about it. So I can just overcut if I want to. And spin this around. And cut. Cut. And And I've got my other block. So now at this point, you want to be careful with these blocks because this is your straight of grain, this is your width of grain. We now have a block that the whole outside edge is bias. So it is stretchy. So it's better to not pull on this or mess with it with the iron. If you need to set these blocks aside because you've gotten busy and need to walk away, don't fold them up so that they're going to need pressing. So we will do that. So you are going to cut all 4 of your strip sets. So let me find my sample blocks here. Okay, so here's one that all the pressing is going towards the brown, and this one is the opposite. My pressing is coming this way, this one's going that way, and you're going to look at the picture on your pattern. And you're going to notice that in this, to make sure you're sewing these right, it's hard to see, but the brown is always the top, and that light cross stitch fabric is always the bottom. So you may want to lay these all out in a row, because you could see, like I could set it like that. So I've got my cross stitch at the bottom, my brown at the top. And when the next block comes, let me get another one. Okay. They're going to, oops, see how you could easily be off. It's going to line up like that. So let me show you what I mean by nesting. So if I had 2 blocks that both were pressed the same direction, and I go to sew these together, when I turn them over, this would not nest, because this is, the seam is going this way, the seam going the same way, and I am going to have 6 layers of fabric if I were trying to line these seams up. But by using a fabric that they are pressed the opposite ways, now I have a seam allowance going towards the cream and a seam pressed towards the brown. And now these are just going to lock right in place. So I will lock those in place, and I will pin at each place where they lock in place. And you can feel that with your fingers. You can feel those seams just nest. And you'll want to make sure that your edges meet and the points meet up. And I usually give a little pin up here at the top just to make sure things don't shift at the corner. And then I go to the sewing machine to sew. And again, I'm making sure that I'm not going to pull on this while I'm sewing. This is stretchy. If you pull on it, when it comes out, you will have stretched it, sewn with it stretched, and then when you take it off the machine, your seam will be wrinkly and gathery. So make sure that you just feed it through nice and straight. So I know I have 2 sewn together here. Here we go. So these 2 I've sewn together, and you can see when you nest, you get beautiful points. You should have a 1/4 inch up here at this point, and that looks really great. Now, I did press these open. I'm not always a fan of pressing open, but pressing open will keep the bulk down and you won't have any big knots in your seam. It'll feel nice and smooth. So you are going to get 8 of these cut, lay them out, sew them together, and you will have your first row. So if you have any questions, feel free to call the shop at 916-483-2955 or drop a question into the comments here on the video and I will get back to you. Thanks.